Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, a board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, I would like to thank our partners for this event, Columbia Alumni Association of Rhode Island and their members for joining us. We are honored to have author, publisher, and historian Pamela McColl to help us celebrate the bicentennial anniversary of the famous poem by Clement Clarke Moore, was the night before Christmas. She has published the very acclaimed book. You can find the link to the book on our website, and we'll make sure to send the link again with the recording of this session within the next 24 hours. Please allow me to briefly introduce Pamela, but I would encourage everyone to check our website for her full bio. Pamela McColl is an award-winning author and publisher and lecturer. In the 90s, she formed a publishing company devoted to bringing books of social and historical significance to the public, including Pacific Spirit, The Forest Reborn, which Senator Frank Murkowski called one of the most important works on forest management in recent years. Among their other works is a publication called On Marijuana, which is a compilation of essays and articles that examines the impact of cannabis on children and communities. Without further ado, Pamela, the floor is.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to this. I have been working on my Twas the Night Before Christmas Bicentennial tour for 10 years, and it's been just a wonderful thing to be involved with. I recently was very pleased to see the White House do such a great presentation of the poem and honoring the poem by decorating this Christmas season. They've given the nod to the poem. In every room of the White House, there's reindeer flying across the ceilings and sleighs and Santa Claus and a display of vintage editions. So it's been really quite a tribute. It was also very pleasing to see the Mayor of New York, Mayor Adams, declare December 23rd, Twas the Night Before Christmas Day, and to see the nomination that I put forward to the New York State Library to have Clement C. Moore inducted into the Hall of Fame accepted. And he will be inducted on December the 19th. So long overdue, and it's wonderful to see that. I also have just been so delighted to see the country celebrating this poem this Christmas season. I have Google alerts on many topics associated with this, and I get a steady feed of all the things going on around the country, from parades, communities, libraries, all kinds of things all over the country, and it's just a wonderful thing to see. The poem is considered to be the most famous poem in the Library of English Literature, and the most republished and the most reillustrated. So there's much to celebrate in this American work, first written in 1822. This is my book that I published last year and I've been touring with. And somebody asked me, how do you write a 264-page book on a poem? But this is not just any poem. This is, as I said, this very famous, much-loved poem that's been read by 10 generations of children. And it's been shared around the world. It's been translated into every major language, including Yiddish, and it has been loved for 10 generations of children. So it's really something. And as I said, a great delight to work on. So we start tonight with Clement C. Moore, the poet of Christmas Eve. Clement C. Moore was born in Manhattan and is born into a very wealthy, very well-educated religious household. He's born in 1779 and he dies in 1863. So it's a fascinating period of history. We're talking the end of the American Revolution into the American Civil War. So much change came to Manhattan during those years, and Clement C. Moore was right in the center of it. He comes from a family who had come to America in 1630. The Moores had come to Elmhurst, now Elmhurst in Queens, and they had developed Newton apples orchards, but they'd also been land developers. And the homestead in the area of Queens is no longer, but however, there's a beautiful park there in honor of Clement C. Moore. The other side of Clement C. Moore's family are the Clarks. And the Clarks come from England. Major Thomas Clark is his grandfather. And he comes to, in his retirement after being a major in the British Army, and he comes to an area which he names Chelsea. And he names it after the church, the hospital in London for veterans. He's a retired major of the British Army himself, and so he does this in honor of that. And as you all know, the district of Chelsea in Manhattan is primarily all lands owned by the Moores back in the 1700s, 1800s. So very interesting family. Moore himself is a graduate of Columbia. He is the valedictorian of his class, and he gave the class a wonderful speech called Gratitude, but although there's a claim for it, there's no copy of it left, which is very unfortunate. I would have loved to have read it, and I worked with Columbia Archives to try and find it, and we have not been able to so far. But the next slide will show you just how small his class was. This is the graduating class of Columbia University, of which Clement C. Moore was part. You'll see John Irving, Washington Irving's brother, and other notable names. Many of these individuals go on to be lawyers. Moore himself is trained and educated as a theologian and a scholar in Oriental studies and classical studies. He's never ordained, but he does take that pursuit. He's a very, very well-educated man. He speaks multiple languages, including Hebrew. He goes on to write the first Hebrew lexicon in the country, the first Hebrew dictionary in America. And he's also credited with bringing Italian opera to New York. So he played many instruments, and he was a very, very educated man. He goes on to be part of the leadership of Columbia for decades. And his father was the bishop of the Diocese of New York and also the president of Columbia University. Here's Bishop Benjamin Moore. So his father was a very, again, very educated individual, attended Columbia, was also the valedictorian of his class, and goes on to be not only the bishop of the Diocese of New York, but the president of Columbia University. One of his claims to fame is that he gave the last rites to Alexander Hamilton. And at the time, he wrote a note expressing his knowledge that it was a duel that killed Alexander Hamilton. Had Moore and one other attending clergyman not written notes about it, it probably would have been written off as a gun accident, in that dueling at that time was illegal. So this is his claim to fame, and other things, of course, but this was one sort of interesting note that I found in my research on him. So the Moores, as I said, a very old American family. They have roots to the Mayflower. I did some genealogy work and discovered their links. So definitely an old American family, and very wealthy in that they own so much land. This is the General Theological Seminary in Chelsea. It's still there. I toured it the other evening. And when Moore graduates from Columbia, he goes on to work at the General Theological Seminary as a professor, teaching classical studies and Oriental studies. And he's there for 30 years. He's there with Julian Verplanck and other prominent people of the time. And this wonderful chapel and all the lands are still there. And it's this land that Clement C. Moore donated for the building of the General Theological Seminary. Originally, it had been apple orchards of his grandmother. And so he donates all this land for the church and for the education of theologians. And this is the same location, as we'll see in the next slide, at Hoffman Hall, where we are going to induct Clement C. Moore into the Hall of Fame. It's a party of 300 people, and we're going to do this big ceremony to honor this man in this location, which means so much, would have meant so much to him. And it's been my great pleasure to reach out to the Moore family. And we have 27 Moore descendants coming to this event, and they're flying in from all over the country. So that will be a really wonderful event. And if any of you are really interested in attending, I think that we still have some space available. So do reach out to me in the next few days if you really wanted to attend that. So Clement C. Moore marries the love of his life. This is Catherine Elizabeth Taylor Moore. She's quite a bit younger than Moore, and but it was very much a love match. And he writes love poetry to her, and she's a poet herself. And some of her poetry appears in Moore's collected works of poetry published in 1844. The Moores go on to have 9 children, And very sadly, two of his children die, and so does his wife at the age of 32. And the man goes on to raise his children and has the help of his mother, Charity Moore, but he never remarries. So very sad and difficult for him to persevere without the love of his life. So she was a interesting woman. She was of English-Scottish background, but she's also of Van Cortlandt. And so that's a very prominent Dutch family name in Manhattan. And so some of this conversation we've had about the Dutch influence on the name of some of the reindeer in the poem may have come from her. I don't know that, but it's a conjecture that I like to think of, that maybe she had a hand to play in the writing of this poem. How this goes is that it was Christmas Eve, and it's 1822, and the Moores are in their home. This is this beautiful home in Chelsea where they lived. And Clement Moore is given the task of going to get a turkey from Greenwich Village. Catherine Elizabeth Taylor is making up charity baskets, and they don't have enough turkeys. They're short one turkey. And so Clement Moore is asked to go out in his sleigh in a snowy evening, and he takes his driver, and off they go. And on the way back, he's struck by the magic of the evening and the jingle bells and the desire to write a poem for his little children. He has 6 at the time, and especially his little daughter Charity wanted a poem for Christmas. And he comes in the house and he writes out the poem that he's dreamt up on the sleigh ride, and he presents it to his family. That's the story. That's the legend. And none of that is factually verifiable. We don't have any of that information. And it's all just a lovely romantic story. And it's possible, but as I said, we have no way of knowing that. All we really know is that Clement Moore laid claim to the poem, and that he wrote that he did write it a long time ago, but he couldn't remember when. That's what he writes in his later years of his life, which has left the door open to all kinds of speculation as to, did he really write it? I personally think that he did write it for a great many reasons, which I will discuss a little bit later. So this is the Queen's Elmhurst homestead of the Moore family. It no longer exists, but the dwellings from the 1630s onward were located here. They were torn down to make room for the Elmhurst subway. So the Moores had spent centuries here, and it's interesting to see that they're part of this whole area and still honored. And right now there's an endeavor to try and find the grave of their first ancestor here, and maybe do a marker or to remember him. He was a very interesting man and very well liked, and died at the age, I think, of 32 or 36. But he left quite a legacy, and a lot of the lands came to him from good relationships with the local people, and that they wanted to award his children with land to honor his good deeds. So interesting family. So in working on Clement Moore, it was really interesting because there have been biographies written about him, short ones, which weren't particularly accurate or documented with footnotes or references. So a lot of it was conjecture. And it's very unfortunate that Clement Moore didn't keep a diary his entire life. He writes in this first page of his diary that's held in the Columbia archives that he wrote this, at the last 5 years of his life. And he writes here, a diary which ought to have begun at least 60 years ago. And that is so true, because if he had have kept a proper diary, then we'd have much better understanding of not only the man, but also of the poem. So that's very unfortunate. I did go to the Columbia archives, and I spent a lot of time reading this diary, reading the diaries and letters of his mother and his father and other relations, such as Nathaniel Fish Moore, his cousin, who was also the president of Columbia University, and who was an amateur but avid photographer. And the only photograph that we have of Clement Moore is in the Columbia archives, and taken by Nathaniel Fish Moore. And I was very pleased to get the rights to reproduce that image in my book. It's the only photograph that exists of Clement Moore. So, but the resources at Columbia, it was quite limited to what we could find about Moore. in those records. And so I had to go places like the Redwood Library in Newport and other places to try and piece together this man's life and get a sense of who he was. And one of the ways I did that was by reading obituaries, by reading his eulogy, and reading letters that his children wrote or his grandchildren, what his students said about him, and newspaper articles, and just tried to piece it together. And what I found was a very kind, benevolent, and very generous individual. Yes, he was very wealthy, but he was very generous. And his major interests were not only music and the arts and languages and Oriental studies and classical studies, but also politics. He wrote a very scathing letter regarding Thomas Jefferson. And he also was very involved in his church. And St. Peter's in Chelsea donated the organ and the land for the church, all kinds of things like that. But he also had an interest in the blind and donated heavily to educating blind children and special education, special needs. So those were also big interests of his. He also looked after not only his wife's sister who was mentally handicapped, but also other individuals in the family, Moore family. So he's a very generous man who reached out and helped people, part of his nature. And so when I heard criticism of him being a man who couldn't possibly have written a poem this lovely for children, I think that's a mistake. I think that he very much was a loving father and grandfather, completely capable of writing this poem for small children, as he did other work, such as a poem about Saratoga Springs, where he took his children on holiday. And so I think that criticism is unwarranted. Moore goes on to write the poem out in his own hand 5 times. We know where 4 of these copies are. They were all done in the 1850s or 1860s, shortly before his death. And they were done on the request of museums or other people who wanted to have this poem signed by him. We know, as I said, where 4 of them are. The 5th one is missing or lost forever. The 3 are in the Huntington, the Rochester, the Strong Museum, and the New York Historical Society in Manhattan. So they're worth between $500,000 and $700,000. And the 4th one is in private hands, and it appeared in Neiman Marcus catalog offered for $700,000 a couple of years ago. So very valuable, very rare, and highly desirable objects in museums. And Moore goes on to also include, as I said, the poem in his book of poetry of 1844. And he takes claim to the poem. It was published in 1823, but he takes claim to the poem in 1837. And that's very important. Okay. So now let's leave Moore for a moment and let's just go back to where he may have come up with the idea of this whole story of Santa Claus arriving on Christmas Eve. This takes us back to the 3rd century of the Roman Empire with the legend of St. Nicholas. This is a painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's in my book, and I think it really says a great deal about where this comes from. This is the legend of Nicholas coming to the rescue of 2 young girls who are going to be sold into slavery by their father because they don't have money to buy them into marriage through dowries. Quite different than our own age. So this kind figure comes and decides to help them out by throwing gold through the window. And he does it the first night. And then the father is so pleased that someone's coming to their rescue that he waits up to see who it is the second night, and he discovers it's Nicholas and confronts him. And Nicholas says, no, I don't want gratitude. I'm doing this because I just want to help and I don't want any praise. Please don't tell anyone it was me. But of course, the father tells everyone. And this is the legend of St. Nicholas. But if you pull the thread through Western tapestry, Western culture, you get to Manhattan in the 1820s and the story of Santa Claus coming at night as an anonymous giver. And this is, I think, a wonderful sort of touch of the past that we can reach back and enjoy something that the Roman Empire was also experiencing and connect with our past in this way. And so my job as a writer and as a historian was to pull this thread through Western culture which means all through the European culture, and then make its way into America. And this is really why it took me 10 years, because there's an extensive research project into how this all developed and the influences on Moore. Moore would have been extremely well versed in St. Nicholas and this whole study of classical literature and everything else. So it's not a very big leap to understand that Moore would have used this as inspiration. So into Manhattan in 1810, 10 years or 12 years before Clement Moore writes Twas, the man on the left is named John Petard. He's a very, very interesting man. And I would highly recommend that everyone Google him and read his biography. It's absolutely amazing what this man achieved in this period of time. John Petard was very interested in developing St. Nicholas as the patron saint of not only Manhattan, but of America. He had this idea that this would be really good for everyone to have this as the patron saint of this country. So what had happened was John Petard had been upset by the revelers in Manhattan during the time at Christmas. Back then, there was quite a bit of drinking and guns and commotion and reveling and misrule, and all these things were going on in the streets during this time. And he'd had a very scary encounter, he and his daughter, where the revelers had actually come into his home and really frightened them. And he really wanted to have a quieter, calmer Christmas, an interior Christmas, and he wanted St. Nicholas to be the big center of it. So the New York Historical Society started to hold dinners, and this is 1810, and they did it in honor of St. Nicholas, and they were really trying to promote it. Bishop Benjamin Moore was part of the New York Historical Society, and Clement Moore is not really part of this, but he's certainly aware of it all, and I think influenced by this as well. So now we come to Washington Irving. Washington Irving was part of this as well. I would never call Washington Irving a political figure, but he certainly wrote about, in Knickerbocker, St. Nicholas. He references him 25 times, and he has him flying over the skies of Manhattan in a wagon. And it's not on Christmas Eve, but it's during this time of the year. And I think that his influence, when he opens up and brings Knickerbocker to the St. Nicholas dinner with the New York Historical Society, is immense. Washington Irving was very, very popular, extremely funny, wonderful writer, and right at the center of the Knickerbockers. And so his influence definitely drove the idea of a St. Nicholas character flying around. What's really interesting is that James Fenimore Cooper, the American writer, he actually comes up with the idea of calling St. Nicholas Santa Claus and converting him into Santa Claus. And he's the first one to do it. And he does that in his novel, The Pioneers, which he writes in 1822 and publishes in 1823, February of 1823. So he's before Twas the Night Before Christmas. So we have to give Washington Irving a great deal of credit here, but we also have to give James Fenimore Cooper a great deal of credit for bringing forward this idea of Santa Claus. And what's really interesting is that with Washington Irving, we also have to give a nod to Sir Walter Scott, who had a great influence on Washington Irving and the idea of Christmas writing. And his visit to Sir Walter Scott in Scotland later on, of course, with Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow. So there's a nod out to Sir Walter Scott as well. All of these writers discuss names of that we get to know as the reindeer, Dunder and Blitzen, with different spelling. You see it in Sir Walter Scott's writing, you see it in Washington Irving's writing, and you see it in James Fenimore Cooper. What's really interesting is that James Fenimore Cooper is the first one to actually name horses Dunder and Blitzen. And there's an idea that possibly all 8 reindeer are named after a stable of horses. We've never been able to find the horse records that substantiates that, but it's come through different family stories that that's indeed the case. Okay. So I am asked a lot about these reindeer. Where did the idea come from? And this is a painting by Hogarth. And I think it's really interesting that reindeer, the Roman Empire writers during the time of the Roman Empire, they noted the domestication of reindeer for transportation, as you see in this picture, and also for milking. So it wasn't a new idea that reindeer pull sleigh. and transport humans. But what's really fascinating is that they become associated with St. Nicholas. And that happens in 1821 with a little book called The Children's Friend. And it's published a year before Twas. And we only have a couple of copies of this little book, which were found not that long ago. And it has a bishop character, a St. Nicholas character, coming on Christmas Eve with a wagon or a sleigh with one reindeer with a bunch of books. And what's really significant is he comes with a birchen rod. And this idea of a bishop character being the judge of children being naughty or nice, and the awarding of a gift or a punishment is inherent in this poem. And I think it's incredibly important that Moore changes this concept and takes away the threat of punishment. And specifically in Twas Night Before Christmas says there's nothing to dread. I think it's a really important aspect of the poem in terms of its longevity and its appeal to children. But I also think it really reflects Moore and his outlook on his Christian values. So here is my book I published in 2012, The Reindeer That We Illustrated. This is, there they are, the 8 reindeer, less Rudolph, of course, who comes way later. But this is what Moore is credited with, these 8 reindeer. This is of his creation, as is the Santa Claus St. Nick character coming and becoming an elf. This is where it all takes place in Moore's writing. He's no longer a St. Nicholas bishop character, religious character. He is an elf, and he's described as an elf, and he's brought into the secular world, which gives his appeal to many people of different faiths, which is really fascinating, given Moore's background in education. So those are the 2 big credits to Moore. So as I mentioned, the poem was written in 1822. This is our thinking by Moore for his children and presented as I described. That's the story we go with. But it made its way to the Troy Sentinel newspaper in Troy, New York for the Christmas of 1823. So a year later, it appears on page 3 of this newspaper, and it appears without a name. So there's no accreditation to Moore or anyone else. The editor of the paper at the time was Orville Hawley. He was a Harvard graduated lawyer, and he wrote a glowing preface to it. He was very well known. He was a very good writer. He wrote a wonderful biography of Benjamin Franklin and other things. So by Orville Hawley coming to this poem in such a supportive way, the poem appeared in other newspapers within weeks and days of it being published in the Sentinel, and goes on to be very popular and published in almanacs and other papers every year after that. So it was very much a good send-off from Orville Hawley. And the Troy Sentinel newspaper, there's only a few editions in the world that still exist. And I believe that the New York Historical Society has one, and the Troy Library. But it was very popular right from the get-go. So this is the very first illustration of Twas Night Before Christmas. This was published in 1830 by the Troy Sentinel, but it's not a newspaper. It was in a broadsheet. These were handed out for newspaper boys to get a tip at Christmas time. They'd give away a broadsheet as a gift, and then the patron would give them some money for it. So this is Myron King, 1830, the very first illustration ever of the work Twas the Night Before Christmas. So after that, 1840, William Coombe comes along, and this is another illustration. I put this in here because I think it's really interesting to see how an illustrator brings their own interpretation to it. And this is what I've found so fascinating in studying 2,500 editions of Twas, is that every illustrator can bring to it what they wish to, and they do. I mean, you have Santa Claus as an elf, you have him as a tiny little character, you have him as a father figure, you have him different races, you have him in different outfits, different colored outfits. It's been just fascinating to see. You have him with Tasha Tudor with corgis everywhere. It's been really fascinating to see what the illustrators have done with the poem and the influence that those illustrations have had on our interpretation of Santa Claus. This is the first time that we know of Santa Claus going down a chimney. This is from the Albany, it's called the New York Mirror, and it was for an advertisement for an Albany toy store. So even the very first time we see Santa Claus, this is a commercial image used to sell toys in a toy store in 1840. Really fascinating. So beautiful illustration as well. But again, look at the variation on the, this is an illustrator just using their own poetic license to do Santa Claus, Saint Nick, the way they wanted to. So now we're into 1840s, and I found this in the Smithsonian, and it's called Christmas Carol. This is the same year that Christmas Carol came out. So Christmas Carol comes 20 years after Twas the Night Before Christmas by Dickens. And it was just a really fascinating thing to see that this poem changed names so many times. But here it is called Christmas Carol. Either a mistake or they're trying to capitalize on the great popularity of Christmas Carol at the time. I don't know, but I just thought it was amusing. And Christmas Carol, as we all know, gave us Christmas dinner. But it really is Twas the Night Before Christmas that gave us Christmas Eve the way we celebrate in North America and many people around the world. Highly influential. And so I always wonder when people say like Dickens invented Christmas, or it's kind of, that's a bit of a leap. Washington Irving certainly had an enormous influence on Charles Dickens. And if you read the Pickwick Papers and you read Washington Irving, there are a great many similarities, and you can see the influence of Washington Irving on Dickens. And they were great friends, and Dickens said that he, carried around Knickerbocker in his pocket, and when it wore out, he had to buy another copy. So he was a great admirer of Washington Irving. So by the 1850s, you still have this conflict of inside-outside Christmas. This is by Winslow Homer, the great American artist. And this is what Pintard was talking about, this conflict of inside-outside. And it doesn't really get resolved until the end of the American Civil War. And what happens after the American Civil War is that you have a whole bunch of things change that make it possible to really promote Christmas. One is you have railroads instead of stagecoaches, so you have great distribution methods now. You can promote things through newspapers and magazines, and you can develop books, and you couldn't carry much around in a stagecoach, but with railroads, you could really move the news. And you also have this enormous desire to go back home after war and horror of the Civil War. People want to go home. They want to celebrate with family. And you also have the influence of a woman by the name of Sarah Hale. Sarah Hale was an editor, and she promoted Christmas. She's the one who wrote to Lincoln 15 times asking him to do Thanksgiving as a national holiday. She was very influential. And she was influenced herself by Queen Victoria. So things like the Christmas tree and wearing white at weddings and Christmas was a very big thing for Sarah Hale. And through the distribution of her magazine, families could really celebrate in the way that she saw as being a really great idea. You also had Christmas trees, you had decorations, you had all these things coming along. So it really changes. And what John Pintard and the Knickerbockers may have wanted to do back in the 1810, 1820 was really taking hold in America through these developments. In 1862, you have the father of American illustration, F.O.C. Doherty, come along, and he does a terrific job of doing Twas the Night Before Christmas. He's still hand tinting these, so they don't have color printing yet, but he was extremely influential, a very major talent, and illustrated Washington Irving, Poe, Dickens, everybody, including Twas. And this is the edition that Teddy Roosevelt read when he was 4 years of age. And Teddy Roosevelt, like so many of us, went on to read it to his children and his grandchildren. And this edition actually is in Sagamore Hill Presidential Library, his personal collection. So one of my favorites and one of the best. This is Doherty again, just absolutely self-taught, absolutely phenomenal talent from Delaware. And his works today are not worth that much. It's really too bad he's fallen to the side a bit, but I think he should have much more prominence. Then you have Thomas Nast comes along, 1863. Again, a phenomenal talent. And he takes on Santa Claus. And here he is the first Santa Claus he ever did, 1863 for Harper's. And it's during the American Civil War. And he's Santa Claus entertaining the troops on the northern troops and giving out presents, and it's very political, and the editorial is very political. But Thomas Nast goes on to be incredibly influential, and he does something very fascinating, which you'll see in the next slide. he comes to it and he brings back in the naughty or nice concept in a very big way. He has Santa Claus with spyglasses. He has lists of children that are good or bad. And he brings it back in. And I just find it fascinating how naughty or nice is so much a part of song today. And, you know, people talk about it and joke about it. You're naughty or nice. It's so prevalent in our Christmas celebrations. And yet in Twas, it's not there at all. And it was purposely not there. You know, remember Nothing to Dread? Like, it was kind, benevolent, it was based on, you know, Christian values of non-judgment and, you know, all of this. And I just find it really interesting that it came back in such a big way. And Nass was a big part of that, I think. So very talented, you know, wonderful and very prolific and extremely well known. And he also had small children, and you often see him illustrate. I think this is actually his son. Okay. So this is the great big thing that happens now, is that Louis Prang comes into America with color printing presses, and everything changes, because now you can print books in color, and you can print art and reproduce art and do all kinds of things. And this man is very influential on Christmas, because he does Christmas cards and he does this wonderful edition of Twas. And he's also very well known across the country and pushes this whole thing along, so that you get these great editions of Twas Night for Christmas in full color now. And these next slides, you know, I put in because they really sort of show examples of what happens here. We go into full color. This is gold gilded, and you're getting into the golden age of illustration. And this is the kind of work that you see, you know, really magnificent. And it takes off, and there's many, many of them. This is in gold and silver. This is called a luxury book. And, you know, this is the kind of thing that starts to happen with Twas Night for Christmas. Then you have Ellen Clapsaddle come to it, very prolific postcard artist primarily, but she really jollies up Santa Claus compared to Nass, and she makes him very happy and fun. And many of you may know Ellen Clapsaddle. She's a very, very famous postcard artist. There's 500 million postcards of hers out there in circulation in many collections all over the place. So she not only does Christmas, but Halloween and all kinds of things, but very, very successful postcard artist. So I think that this is a, you know, really important moment in American art when Howard Pyle comes along. This was the only painting of Santa Claus by Howard Pyle I could find. Many of you may know him from the pirate images and Robinson Crusoe and all kinds of books that he illustrated. He was an incredible talent, but he also was an amazing mentor to American illustrators. So he started the Drexel Institute at the Brandywine, and he nurtured not only young artists, but particularly young female artists. He made a rule that half his class had to be women. And out of that come the great Jessie Wilcox Smith, Gertrude Kay, and all kinds of other great talents. And he also, in his class, had people such as N.C. Wyeth. So, you know, really something, and a major, major contribution to American illustration through Howard Pyle. This is N.C. Wyeth, one of his students, and this was a beautiful image, and I was very sad to find that it's a stolen piece of art. We don't have that right now. We're trying to find it, or I think the FBI are trying to find it too, but it's a lot of his works are missing, but he's one of my very favorites. And in working on this project, it's been wonderful to go and visit some of these artists' studios and homes and galleries. And I was able to see his studio this summer, and I highly recommend all of you make the journey to Brandywine to visit the Wyeth's home. The Wyeths were very, very fond of Christmas, and they'd get up on the roof and jingle bells and Santa Claus outfits and everything else. And I've read lots of letters about it from Jamie Wyeth and Andrew Wyeth. And one of my things I worked on was to try and sort of find an artist that I loved through my life and think, did they do Santa Claus? Did they do Twas the Night Before Christmas? And people like Maxfield Parrish, who I really like, I discovered that he illustrated St. Nicholas for Washington Irving's, you know, Knickerbocker book. But when I came to the Wyeths, I thought, did Andrew Wyeth ever paint Santa Claus? I know his wife did, but did Andrew Wyeth? And to my great surprise and delight, I discovered that in Christina's world, in the painting called The Open Window, there's a red and white stocking hanging off the bedpost, which I think was a bit of a nod to his father, who was this great big fan of Christmas. And this wonderful image of Santa Claus is one of his best. So at the turn of the century, we have we're still in the golden age of illustration in America, and you have many, many editions coming out. But I think it's worth noting Denslow, because Denslow was a very eclectic artist, very interesting, very creative. This is probably one of the best editions of Twas because it's so original. And he is this little elfy guy. And I love this edition. I have a couple of copies of this, and I think it's great. They're not expensive. You can get them for a couple of $100 sometimes on eBay, but this was fabulous. And he's very well known for doing The Wizard of Oz. And his edition of Wizard of Oz is the one with the green cover with the lion. And it was, I think, the first edition of Wizard of Oz. He made so much money off of these two projects that he bought an island and moved there and called himself King Denslow. So he was definitely a bit of a eclectic individual, but very, very talented and very whimsical. And then we come back to Jessie Wilcox Smith, who I mentioned, who came from the Howard Pyle Drexel Institute, one of America's finest illustrators. She was prolific, she was brilliant, and she was extremely successful. And her originals are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This edition of Twas it's anywhere between $300 and $700, depending on where you're buying it from. But it isn't that valuable compared to some of the other books because there were so many of them, because she was so well known that they printed and printed and printed them. But it's also a very classic edition, and it's very quintessential Twas. Very talented individual. This is one of her pages in this edition of 1912. So very talented. So when you're working on a book like this, it's fun to sort of discover things that you weren't looking for. And this was one of the stories. This is the story of the Odell family. And I found it fascinating that the oldest copy of this poem that we know to exist is from paper that's watermarked 1824. And it's in the family collection of the Odells up in Fredericton in Canada. How it got there, we don't know. Who they are, we do know. The next slide shows Jonathan Odell, who was Clement C. Moore's godfather. Very good friends of Clement C. Moore's parents. And what we know about this individual was that he was a surgeon, a poet, very interesting man. But we also know that he was on the side of the British during the American Revolution. And he actually was the individual who transcribed the documents between Andre and Benedict Arnold during the defection affair. So a very interesting man. And he leaves and goes to England after the American Revolution and never comes back to America and lives in Canada on a government appointment. But what's interesting is that he does keep in touch with Clement C. Moore. There are letters between the two of them. And how this poem got into the hands of his daughter, we don't know. There's some theory, and some scholars believe that it was transcribed from hearing versus copying. But what's really interesting is there's other poems of Moore's also in that collection. So the people who would sort of maybe question the authorship, that's another point of contention, that this poem came with other poems from the Moore household, probably. So interesting story. And I didn't know about this until I was really into my research, and I discovered these people and who they really were. And the next slide is really fascinating, because I was working at the Smithsonian. And I found this letter from George Washington, and it's giving Jonathan Odell, the spy, free reign to travel and not to be molested by anyone or disturbed. And it appears from this letter that George Washington wasn't aware of this man's espionage or spy or his activities with the British. So I just found this interesting. And so when I was at Mount Vernon this year visiting, I gave note of this to their archivist, and we may pursue it. I don't know if they knew about this, so kind of fun. It's kind of things you do when you're researching, you just find things. So back to Thomas Nast for a minute here. This is considered to be the portrait of Santa Claus. It's painted by Thomas Nast. It's fascinating because he has a long pipe, and yet the poem is supposed to have a short little stump of a pipe. But it just shows, you know, the license of illustrators to do what they want. And it's an interesting image. It was very, very popular in the 1980s. It was on everything. And but I still think it's considered the portrait of the character from this book, this poem, and the most influential character ever created in English literature. and outsells everyone and is extremely influential. This is the first red Santa Claus costume. This is 1880, and 40 years, he's been coming down the chimney, but this is the first time that we see him in red. Another big discovery I made when I was working on this was that Santa Claus had a childhood, and in this story written in 1922 by Sarah Addington, it's a lovely little story about how Santa Claus grows up as a little boy with his siblings. And one of the most fascinating things was that he had a grandmother named Mother Goose. And I looked that up. I thought, well, where does this come from? And I discovered that Mother Goose had always been part of Christmas, always. In London especially, there were pantomimes with Mother Goose and Christmas. And Thomas Nast had, in the 1860s, through the 1880s, had drawn illustrations of Mother Goose with Santa Claus. So I find this really interesting that we've lost this thread of Mother Goose being part of the Santa Claus story. And I don't know why we lost it, because it's quite endearing. But this is my book I published this year. It's the 200th anniversary of Twas for Christmas, as I mentioned. And I just wanted to say that I don't know if any of you know, but in 2012, I published this book Without the Smoking Santa Claus. And I did it for a reason. I wanted to bring attention to the fact that children prefer a smoke-free Santa, and that they really, worry when Santa smokes. So I thought, this is a poem that's written for children. We're in the 21st century, and all that we know about tobacco and what we know about tobacco prevention, there's a reason that we killed Joe Camel, and that was because we don't want to have cartoon characters smoking, because it sends the wrong message to children. And so that's really where I started my journey, and it was an incredible story to be part of, because it went international. I had some really big pushback from Stephen Colbert doing a spoof on me, and Barbara Walters getting involved in The View, and it went all over the world. It was talked about in China and India, and it's kind of funny, but I guess my claim to fame is that I'm the one who got Santa to quit smoking. And it's been just fascinating how doing something as small as that has made a real impact, because I've been invited to speak at the Office of Drug Control for the United Nations a couple of times. I've had this huge platform thanks to this whole project. And I also, when I was working on this, decided to do this bicentennial project. And when I was working on this, I learned it would be 200. So this is where it all began. And I cannot tell you how thrilled I am, how the poem has been received in this year. And I just think it's great to see people who are 70 years old, or, grandparents, reading this poem to little children, because by doing that, they'll have the legacy that we've all had of every Christmas, a loved one reading it to us, and it being part of our family Christmas. And so that, to me, secures this poem's future. And I see it having another 200 years and being loved by many people. And it's not a message poem per se. It's, at the very heart of it, exciting. It's about hope and trust and faith, about belief, about wonderment, about creative thinking, and children just plain love it. And that's enough. If you see a 2-year-old light up when they hear it, that's great. So it'll always be part of Christmas literature, in my opinion, because it is just basically really good. So I think that's there's a couple more slides here, and then we'll take questions. I always like to just reference this. If you're looking for something to watch, this is a really funny one. This is King Charles with Camilla and Judi Dench and Maggie Smith and Daniel Craig, and they're reading the poem. And it's just a fun one to go and look on YouTube. It's easy to find, and I just enjoy this one. He's very giggly and laughy, and it's kind of fun. And then I'll just wrap it up by saying that, Clement Moore, as I said, he's being inducted into the Hall of Fame, but he also is honored, and has been for 100 years plus, at the Church of Intercession in Manhattan, where they walk to his grave, they recite the poem, and they leave a wreath every single Christmas. The week before Christmas, the Sunday before Christmas. They're doing it this year, and this is a lovely way to celebrate the man and the poem. And as I said, they've been doing it for over 100 years. So, and as I said too, the poem's in English, Spanish, French, and Mandarin, and every other major language. And this was the original edition of my book. I just chose this cover. I had a long discussion with myself of who to put on the cover. It could have been Eddie Warhol, could have been NCY, both do Santa Claus, but I chose this because I just love this endearing Santa, and I think it sort of sends the right message. So thank you very much, and I'm very looking forward to questions that you may have.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we have a ton of alum here with us tonight. So
Great.
We are recording. I'll start off with that, and we'll share the recording in a couple of days. We have a couple of questions already coming in. My name is Miyako Yerrick, and I'm the admin for the Columbia Alumni Club here in DC. So if you have questions and anything came up during the talk, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A function, and then I can read them to Pam from there. All right, so one of the first questions that we had come in is that it was just such great information. So is everything that you shared in your book, or can you kind of talk about what is in the book?
Sure. Well, my book does go through most of what I just said, but in a much more extensive way. And it also has art on pretty well every page, or there's an image on every page, because this is what fascinated me so much was the art legacy. It's from Andy Warhol to Leyendecker to Jessie Wilcox Smith, Norman Rockwell. It's just fascinating how many people, great talents that are household names, came to this poem. So, but I covered the St. Nicholas. I cover a little bit about Western culture, European culture, how it came into America, and then I also developed the sort of footnotes that go with the images. I had this thing where I had so much information, and some of it was so interesting, and you just don't want to leave it on the floor, when you're editing. And so I have sort of extensive footnotes with little bits of information that I just found, worth sharing with you. Like when I was working on this, I found, to my surprise, how many women were involved in illustration and art. It was an acceptable career path. How many women were in, the literary arts? I mean, the first published American writer isn't a woman. So I put that in there because it was just so interesting for me. And The Children's Friend was the first lithograph book printed in America. Isn't that fun? The first book printed in America was of a reindeer bringing a sleigh with books for children. I mean, right? So you just want to put those. So that's really what my book's about. That's why it's 264 pages long.
Great. Well, I think everybody here is really excited to go out and get a copy. And we have a question. I want to get to him. John is in Ireland. It's past midnight, but he stayed up to watch. And so he says, thank you so much for your research and presenting such a wonderful book. What was your personal highlight from your research?
Probably seeing Clement C. Moore's photograph by Nathaniel Fish Moore at Columbia Archives, because that was really thrilling. Like I'd seen there's I think 6 or 8 portraits of the man at different stages of his life, but to see a photograph, and he's an elderly gentleman playing chess with his daughter, and it was kind of moving. And I think also when I was at Columbia reading his diary, and it was sealed. There was a letter sealed, a little bit of black wax. How they had wax on seals. And a little speck fell off, and I had this moment of being really close to Clement C. Moore. And I think the other big thing was 2-3 years ago at Christmas Eve, and I was turning off my computer, and then I saw an alert come in, and it was an article by a journalist from Bloomberg, and he'd written a really extensive, really well-researched, brilliant piece actually on the slavery issue and more. And I already had a very strong feeling, and I'd done a lot of research by pulling the slave records and everything to find out if he'd actually had slaves, because some of the biographers said that he did. And he laid out the case that he did not. It's the wrong generation, and it's the wrong man. And I agree with this position. So that was a wonderful Christmas Eve surprise. And I actually looked up and thought, okay, is this my gift from Clement C. Moore tonight? But he based it on a story about someone rescuing girls from slavery. So it kind of fits that he didn't have slaves, nor did he inherit them, right? So.
Well, we have a couple of questions. One is from a descendant of Moore and is asking for the date and location again of the Bicentennial Celebration.
Sure. It's in Manhattan, and it is December the 19th, the General Theological Seminary at 5:30 till 8. It's going to be an amazing thing. They're launching a new film, and they're launching a new musical composition based on this. we're inducting Moore in the Hall of Fame. We have about 12 people, speaking over in about an hour, and it's going to be great. I'm just thrilled by it, and I think there's 27 Moores coming. As I said, I think there's 27 right now, so they're going to have like a little family reunion.
Maybe there could be 28 if Christian Miles can get up there. All right. We also have a question from Anne, who says her family owns the 1855 book created by Mary Clark Moore Ogden. How do you recommend getting it authenticated and maybe valued?
Well, there's only one that I know of in the Moore's family collection, because this was done by his daughter in 1855, her husband, Dr. Jonathan Ogden. And in 1951, there was a Life magazine reproduction of it. That's the only time I've ever seen it printed. So it could be that. I don't know what she has exactly, but the only ones that I know of are the original, and then these magazine copies where you actually could cut it out and fold it and make it into something. So it could be, not sure what it is. The American Antiquarian Association or the New York Historical Society could certainly help, probably. Or the William and Mary Library, who have the biggest collection of Twas in the world. The Swen Library at William and Mary, or the Westchester at Pennsylvania, they have a huge collection. So there's lots of big collections out there. So the Baldwin Library, there's lots of them. I would just find a really reputable organization. Even the American Antiquarian Bookseller Association could probably help. But it's likely it's that 1951 magazine, because I only know of one, but then somebody may have made copies of it for a Christmas card. Sometimes people reproduce these things like 100 for their friends, and they can look pretty authentic, but it's a beautiful thing. I've seen it. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So we have a ton of questions coming in. I'm going to get to as many as we can in this half hour here.
Okay.
We've had Jane also said she stayed up until 1:30 a.m. in Italy and said she was reading it to her brand new granddaughter on the 23rd in his honor. And we have some questions on if you've read this to your children or grandchildren and passed it along as well.
Yes, I read it. I had the copy my father read me when I was 4. I still have it. It's one of my favorite possessions. I read it to my children, the blue pop-up book of 1988. It's worth a couple $100. Pop-up books are really, they become very valuable because they often get ruined, right? So, and then I just read it to my granddaughter, Ruby, who's 2 years old. And I read it through a teddy bear who was reading it to her, and it was great. And I also read the same thing on Kids Lit for the New York Public Library TV show. We did the same thing, which you can download and get. So that was really fun.
Karen says, thank you so much for this excellent and entertaining presentation. What prompted your fascination with the poem, and how did you decide when your research was complete, or are you still continuing to do research?
I am still continuing. I found something yesterday in the Redwood Library, the oldest library in America, and I was speaking there in Newport, and I found something. So there are things, you always sort of go looking to see if you can expand on this, just for your own intellectual interest. I also got a copy of Clement C. Moore's, he wrote the first history of Columbia University, and I went and got a copy of the first edition because I wanted to read it, and it's really wonderful. If you ever can get a hold of it, it's from 1825, and when Moore writes this and presents it, it's the first meeting of your alumni ever. He was the first speaker. Isn't that fun?
Wow.
And at that meeting, they decided to start an alumni in 1825, May of 18, with Clement C. Moore, right? Isn't that fun?
Perfect event for our club.
Yeah, so those are the kind of things, right? But I follow Seth Godin's advice. He's my mentor, and Seth Godin said, ship date, you have to have an end date. You have to know when you're shipping this thing. And I had a bicentennial to work towards, so it was easier for me to say, okay, it was very hard to do it because I, loved the research part and collecting art. I loved it. I miss it, but you have to have a ship date. It's really good advice.
And did you do any research into the musical settings around the poem and that it's inspired? Beth says Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians recorded the night before Christmas. Yep.
Yes, definitely. Like, I didn't do it as much as I could have. And I'll be really fascinated to see on the 19th this new composition that they've done. It was commissioned by the General Theological Seminary. I've never heard it, so it'll be great. but there's ballets. Two of the really fun things to go on YouTube and find is the two original films from the 1880s, I think, or 1890s. And they're only like a minute or two, but they're really good. They're really good. They're out of the British Film Museum, but you can download them on YouTube, and they're wonderful to watch. They're just great.
Did you have any more you could say on if there were other people, possible people who could be authors? If it wasn't him, who else was considered?
Well, Henry Livingston II is considered. However, Moore claims it was his. He wrote his name to it 5 times. He defended it in 1837 when it appeared in the paper under the name of someone else. And he put it in his own book of poetry. So to deny Moore, you'd have to have some very good evidence, because you'd have to make him out to be a liar. And that's a really hard thing to do if you don't have really good evidence. I mean, that's a really big stretch. And they don't come to this conversation until 60 years after it's been published. So this conversation starts. And just think in your own family, if someone started talking about something that happened 60 years ago, that's a long time. And so stories can sort of evolve, right, and change, and right, and with no factual basis to them. But the very major scholars in the world, like Scott Noseworthy, who has done a great deal of work on this, gives it to Moore. So, yeah, I think it's Moore. And I had, when I nominated into the New York State Library Hall of Fame, I had to write a paper on how I could defend Moore, and it passed their muster. So, right, yeah.
Great. We have somebody who's asking how they can get a signed copy of your book.
Oh, I just signed a bunch today. I'm in Newport right now, and there are signed books at the Island Bookstore in Milton, Rhode Island. They can send one out. I can send one out if you want. I think there's still time. They can go, media mail for like $5 or $6 anywhere in America. So, if you email me, I could probably get one out to you, or figure that out. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. A little bit of a different turn here on a question. Is there anything throughout your research on the poem that was disturbing, or maybe something you didn't expect?
Disturbing? No, not really. I mean, I think just that comment from Moore that says, I wrote this poem a long time ago, but I don't remember when. That's always kind of, it's a bit of a bother, right? Why can't you remember when you wrote it? But he was older then, maybe, I don't know. It's just odd. And he writes that on the bottom of one of the poems, like one of the signed copies. It's kind of like, what's that about? So that kind of, and it certainly bothers me when people say things that are wrong about the man. And they say that he was a curmudgeon. I mean, for heaven's sakes, the man lost his beautiful wife. He lost his children. He lost his grandchild at the age of 4. He had some real blows in his life. He was a very scholarly, academic individual. But he's completely capable of writing children's poetry, especially for his children he loved. And like Robert Southey, the poet laureate, wrote 3 Bears and Goldilocks. So these men were capable of writing things for their children. To say that he was a curmudgeon and capable of doing this, you didn't read the letters from his children then, because he was a very loving man and well regarded by everyone. So. I found that interesting when people said he wasn't nice enough to write this poem. That's just completely, and that was part of the goal of me working on his life, was to sort of correct that, to give a more balanced perspective on the man.
And did you say you had your original version come out about a decade ago, and then this one just came out recently? So what did you change from that first version, or what did you add into the one that was just published?
It's the same. I did not put the smoking back into it. That would have been completely hypocritical of me to do. I really stand behind what I did. And I read letters from children about them worrying about their parents smoking and willing to give up Christmas presents, and they write letters to Santa Claus saying, I don't need presents, I just need you to get my parents to quit smoking. And so for children to see this character smoking, like, that's not fair to do to a 6-year-old who just wrote a letter to Santa Claus saying, help me. And then she opens up this beautiful poem and it's ruined. Like, so, I really stand behind that whole thing big time.
Anne asks if you can speak about the Coca-Cola Santa ad.
Sure. Well, Coca-Cola comes along and and so does Walt Disney. I mean, these great, enterprises, they take it on. But I always say Coca-Cola just gave Santa Claus an enormous PR campaign. He took him around the world, and there's nowhere that Santa Claus hasn't gone thanks to Coca-Cola. And he's shared this great character who represents love and non-judgmental character, and just this lovely, lovely character. And I was at a dinner party the other night speaking, and I said that he's gone everywhere. The only place he hasn't been is space. And that if anybody has Elon Musk's email, could they pass it along to me? Because I'd like Twas to go to space. I'd like to go to Mars or the moon or somewhere. And after the dinner, someone came up to me and said, I don't have Elon Musk's email, but my uncle works for NASA. So Twas may go to space, which I think would be great.
You showed in one of the pictures, it was used as an ad for a toy company.
Yes.
Kind of showing the commercialization of Santa Claus kind of early on. Have you seen that change or go into another realm beyond that? It's kind of more, I feel like, in the commercialization side rather than the religious side.
Sure. Well, I mean, not only Coke, but cigarette companies took on Santa Claus. They had him putting packages of cigarettes all over trees and things. I mean, we have a huge collection of all of that. It's in San Francisco, but it's this whole dilemma of Santa Claus. Who he really is. Is he a secular character? Is he a religious character? Is he a commercial salesperson? I found it really interesting that in the Supreme Court of America in the 1980s, he was deemed, a secular character, in that he can be anywhere. He can go to school. He can go anywhere. Public buildings, everywhere, under the Establishment Clause in the Constitution. So, it's just so fascinating to see this very, very influential character in all these different guises. And he's certainly been hijacked by all kinds of people for commercial interests, but he remains, at the heart of love and Christmas, and, and thinking of other people and charity. Look at all the Santa Claus drives and empty stocking fund drives, and he does so much good in the world too, but he absolutely personifies love and charity and anonymous giving, like from St. Nicholas.
Brian asks, in what year did Santa truly go global as a widely known character, and what was the main catalyst for that?
It's a really good question. It goes into England really early, because that's a lot of the books and the publishers were coming from England. So it enters into England quite early, but it goes, I think it's really through, Disney has a huge influence on this, because Mickey Mouse and Disney loved this poem, and he takes it into all kinds of realms too, and with his mass popularity. But I was really shocked when I saw it in China and India, my story. I didn't know the depth of this. That they knew all about Santa Claus, and that the fact that he stopped smoking was a news story in China and India. I found that really amazing, right? I didn't know that it had gone that far, but it remains very much a North American Christmas Eve. I mean, it's especially American, because a lot of other countries, yes, they love this poem, but they have Père Noël, or they have other traditions, and so they can welcome the poem and enjoy reading it. But it's not quite the same as, we've got Santa Claus parades, and it's so much focus in North America on Santa Claus and Christmas Eve, right?
And I think for North America, at least most of us, we get snow, it gets cold. You have that kind of visual that is in some of these original kind of portraits. But we also have a question on what are some clever and unique visual themes you might have seen for Santa in the Southern Hemisphere, or, Hawaii, where you don't have the pine trees and the snow.
Oh, sure. Or Australia. I mean, they do it up really well too. And it's, the whole Christmas in July, it's, there's so many editions of this. I've seen every version. I've seen, Twas Night for Christmas under the sea. This year there's one out called The Guinea Pig's Christmas, Twas Night for Christmas. There's so many versions of it. So yes, I've seen all kinds of versions in Southern Hemisphere for sure. But again, it's cultural. I publish it in Spanish, French, and Mandarin, as well as English, and I have for 10, 12 years. And yes, the Spanish does really well in America, but around the world, it doesn't. they're popular, but they don't take over customs that are already there, right? Yeah.
You also had in one of your pictures that there was the reindeer without Rudolph, and you said that he was added later. Can you talk a
Yes.
little bit more about kind of how he was added?
Well, he comes along much later, 1937. So he comes along because Robert May for a department store is hired to do a brochure for the department store, and they do a mass printing of this little story about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and they hand them out for free to customers. And then, of course, it takes off, and it's a really big deal. And the last question too about popularity, when you see this poem sort of put into film and sort of introduced into other medium, it really takes off as well. So even right now, like you've got, ballet, you've got Twas Night for Christmas, Cirque du Soleil's version. Like it branches out and goes everywhere in song and film, and it just has so many variations to it. It's really helped the spread of the poem. But yeah, it's every nationality. I mean, there's versions for, I've seen, Portuguese ones, I've seen, Puerto Rican ones. There's Twas Night for Christmas all over the place. There's just versions of it. There's some, and also there's like teddy bear version and mouse version and pirate version and cat versions. It's just and and the poem's been done, like I said, 2,500 books, hard, physical books. But then it's been done in spoofs, and it's been done on shower curtains and playing cards and china and bed sheets. I mean, it's just it's everywhere, right?
Yeah. And you've talked a little bit about kind of the lasting power of the message, but what do you think really gives it that staying power to cross into so many different domains and across 200 years now?
It's a couple of things. One is because it's read to a child at a very early age, and it's built into this loving sort of having somebody read it to you at this magical time of the year. Around a Christmas tree. It's such a crazily great time of the year, right? I'm seeing this with my 2-year-old granddaughter. That's the train rides with the Christmas lights, and it's great. And so it's built into that, and then it's read every year by the family. So it's this legacy, and I hear it everywhere I go. Oh, we read that. I went, yeah, you and everyone else, everybody else too, right? So it's that. But it's also it's just this magical thinking. It's this quality, this creativeness of it, right? It's filled with hope and wonderment and trust and belief, and those are really important, for human development and human joy, to have those qualities. And that's what this poem's about. That Santa's going to come, and it's exciting. I mean, it colors our world to have these kind of pieces of literature and characters. I just can't imagine a world without children's literature and characters like this, and reindeer that fly. And I mean, it's just, as I said, it colors our world in a wonderful way. The world would be very gray and bleak if we didn't have all of this. So I think that's part of it. We just gravitate to things like this because they make us feel good. And I said earlier, this is a very kind poem. There's nobody getting beaten up. I think it's really important.
I think you said that you had read this when you were growing up as well. How did you kind of change how you read the story from a child into kind of older age and then actually doing the research for the book?
Well, it's funny because like some people say, well, I stopped believing in Santa Claus. I don't think I ever did. I think I'm kind of like N.C. Wyatt. I think I'm like Mark Twain. Like, there's a value in believing these kind of characters and just accepting them as part of your world. And I mean, I think it adds to my life to have these great literary characters part of my world. I grew up with it, right? I had a great sort of education in children's literature. I was very fortunate to have a lot of people around me who supplied me with books. So Charlotte's Web and Snoopy and everybody else have always been part of my world, and they are today. I mean, I'm 65 years old and I have the Grinch in my car because I'm traveling all over America. I've been on this 50-day book tour with 120 events, and the Grinch is my passenger seat. He's sitting there, and he's not just a piece of green fur. I mean, there's much more that goes on with the Grinch and I, because it just adds. I'm a very creative person, and it just adds to my life to have these characters. So I don't think I ever stopped believing in Santa Claus. I don't know why you would. It adds to my life. I just think that people say I don't believe in Santa Claus. I go, that's really unfortunate. for you. Right? You know, like Snoopy is our family mascot, you know, like it's just fun. It's creative and fun. Why not?
We have a comment from Odile, and she says she's French, but remembers vividly when her sister, who had gone to Cambridge, brought back a pop-up book of "Twas the Night Before Christmas" and how it had impressed everyone. They didn't know the poem at the time, but now they always place it at the foot of their Christmas tree.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And then Peter says, just again, thank you for such a great presentation, and everybody's loving your enthusiasm for this book. And then we have a question on Moore's political piece about Jefferson.
Right. Well, I mean, you can read it. It's online. You can go and find it. I've read it recently. It's great. Like, I seriously recommend reading it, and you get a real feel for the man. He was definitely politically motivated as well, Moore, and he takes on the issue of slavery. So there you go. It's another reason to correct the record on slavery and war. I mean, I think it's worth saying that Bishop Benjamin Moore did own slaves. He actually financed some slave ships. So, you know, the Moore family certainly prospered in some way from that, which I think needs to be acknowledged. But this man, Moore himself, you know, I think it's a very different story. And the Thomas Jefferson letter explains that. Yeah.
And were there any other pieces from Moore? I think obviously maybe not as popular as this poem, but did he have other pieces of literature or poetry that got published that you would suggest we also look into?
Not really. Not really. Twas is really quite standalone. I mean, there's some that are, I've read all of his poems, and some of them have certainly academic ability. I mean, there's certainly like quality poems, especially about the Greek Revolution. That's a really good poem. You know, he writes about the Greek Revolution. He was very involved in the Greek Revolution, funding it, like helping to fund it, the Greek fund. But nothing like this. You know, I think it's probably, you know, his letter, his history of Columbia University is really good. It's really, really interesting. It's really well done. It's the first history. It's really great to read. But his Hebrew lexicon, I would say, is probably his, he'd probably be the proudest of that. He didn't want to take credit for this poem because he wanted to be taken seriously as a scholar, right? So that's why he doesn't say anything until 1837. He waits all those years, and then finally he does say, yes, it's mine. But that's a long time, from 1823 till 1837 to claim it. But I understand that. I mean, not a lot of people back then, like Sir Walter Scott, doesn't sign his name to anything until 1828. Like, you know, a lot of these people publish things anonymously. It's really until Dickens and Washington Irving, sort of with the whole copyright conversation, come along, and you know, and they want to have, you know, protection for their, you know, revenue stream. That's what it's really all about. Moore had no interest in making money off his poetry. You know, Moore is a very, very wealthy individual, and he just did poetry, as many men of his education did, for his own enjoyment, you know, and to show his abilities. But the level of the man's education, and many of the people that graduated from Columbia, it's amazing, given they didn't have computers, and how intelligent they were. Really remarkable.
Is there any other information about Moore at Columbia that you can share with us?
Well, not really. I mean, his sons, you know, two of his sons, I think, go there, and he just had a great relationship with the institution for so many years. I think he was a trustee, and he was a secretary, I believe, and kept records for 30 years on all the meetings and things. So he was very involved in it, but was never the president. He has 2 degrees from Columbia, and then he has an honorary doctorate, I believe. But he has a bachelor's and a master's. He was never ordained. I think I've already mentioned that, even though he studied theology.
And we have a question on if there are royalties for his work, and if so, where do they go?
No, never. Because it was published anonymously in 1823, nobody ever made nobody in the Moore family made money off the poem. And the only time they would have made money was off the publication of poems written in 1844, his collected works. But I doubt that book made very much money. It wasn't really a big hit. But no, there would be no royalties. It's public domain, very much so.
And is there anything else that kind of a story or anecdote that you found in your research that didn't make it into the book that you can share?
Oh, no, I think it's pretty well all there. The there's lots and lots. There's lots of information in the book that we haven't talked about tonight. There's the whole Constable family connection, William Constable, the aide de camp de Lafayette, their family connection to the poem. There's some really interesting things in here about Lady Holland, his first cousin who lives in Kensington, and her incredibly notorious life. There's really interesting things about Charity Moore's letters to her cousin about the American Revolution. There's interesting things about all of these, both sides of this family, and how influential they were. Really, really interesting family. And not a lot has been written about them. And I find that there isn't a biography of Moore is really amazing, a credible one, right? There's ones that are, they're making things up. You just know they are, and you don't know, where they got their information from. There's no footnotes, but so.
All right. Well, I want to just remind everybody again that we are recording the event, and we'll share the link to the recording in a day or so. And if you have any other information you want to share, we will, of course, share the link to buy the book. But that one person had asked if they can get the signed copy. So if we can, if you're okay, let us know how much we can share.
I'm sure I can handle that. Sure, there's lots of bookstores that have signed copies. I've been running around for 50 days signing books all over the place. So,
Great. And so, yeah, I think that's it. I'd love to turn it back over to you for any closing thoughts.
Well, I just hope that everybody does read this poem to young children because it secures their future. And not to get political, but in the age that we're living in, it is so important to acknowledge how fabulous Western culture is and this whole tapestry of art and literature and everything else. And I, as a cultural historian, I really see it as something that we need to protect and celebrate and not tear apart and not tear threads out of it. The good and the bad, it's what it is, but it is pretty magnificent. And I think having written this book and gone through Western culture, because we're talking about the Roman Empire to the 21st century, right? Pretty extensive. And I just was so amazed by so much talent and such generosity of spirit in so many people in the arts that I just like to, put that out there that we need to defend it. And when you see Santa Claus attacked, and he is these days, I've seen things where, people don't want to go to Santa Claus parades because it's religious, and it's just, I just have to rely on Chief Justice Berger, who said that's an overreach. And when I saw the White House celebrating Twas Night for Christmas the way they have, I was worried a little bit because, some people would say it's Christian based, it's St. Nicholas, but under the Establishment Clause of the American Constitution, you are allowed to have religious expression, freedom of religious expression. It doesn't mean exclusion, it means inclusion, which means if you have Santa Claus who's an elf, or if you see him as St. Nicholas as a religious character, you can also have other characters and other religious symbols. And we need to make room for all of this in our lives, in our world, and not be excluding and cutting down people such as Santa Claus. I will defend Santa Claus, and and that's way more than just him being an elf. It's him being a symbol of a Christian character, and I think there's room for everything. And I just so that's my position as a 65-year-old. That's sort of how I view things, and I will stand up for him going forward.
Great. Well, thank you again so much on behalf of everyone. We're getting tons of thank yous coming in. So thank you again. Everybody read the poem in the coming weeks. Share it with your friends and family. Brian says eat lots of cookies so we can all fill out a Santa suit.
Good idea.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.